Welcome to Peoples and Things, a podcast about human life with technology. I'm your host, Lee Vinsel, an associate professor of science, technology, and society at Virginia Tech. You can reach me with comments and suggestions at leevensel@gmail.com or on Twitter at sts_news. I would love to hear from you. Hype around digital technologies, and by hype I mean unrealistic, near-term projections of technological change, is a recurring theme on this podcast. Hype is what you get from entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, and university presidents. It's the promise that great things are just on the horizon, and that the future is going to be a brighter, happier place. But there's a flip side to hype, something I call Critihype. It too believes that our technological future will be radically different than our present, or that we are living in the midst of a technological revolution. It just flips the prediction over and asserts that the future will be dystopian, not utopian. A great example of Critihype is the popular Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma. And here I'm putting that word documentary in scare quotes. Now, maybe down the road we'll do an entire episode on just how bad, how truly terrible the social dilemma really is. But for now, I will just say that its premise, that social media companies are able to control our minds like puppet masters, is without foundation. Indeed, like a lot of the worst Critihype, you might even suspect that the makers of the social dilemma were being paid by digital technology firms. Because Facebook, Google, and these other companies make most of their money selling advertisements. They would love for everyone to believe that their ads can control our behavior, when a good deal of evidence suggests the opposite is true. The result of both hype and Critihype, and how journalists repeat both of them, is that our information environment about current technological change is awful. It's not reliable. We are inundated with unrealistic forecasts of change, both positive utopian and negative dystopian. So where do we turn in such a context for good information? Well, mercifully, there are lots of people doing good work on the social and political dimensions of digital technology. Some of them have already been on this podcast, and more will be down the road. But one place I have reliably turned to over the years is the AI Now Institute at New York University. And someone I've really come to respect over the last few years is Meredith Whittaker, the co-founder and faculty director of AI Now and Minderoo research professor at NYU. In this conversation, we talk about her fascinating career, starting at Google and then transitioning to academia. And we talk about her work and her hopes for a better future. I hope you enjoy our chat. Get excited. Meredith, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thank you so much, Lee. I'm very happy to be here.
I thought we might use your recent Nature article as a jumping off point. It's co-written with Jathan Sadowski and Salome Viljoen. Is that right? How do you say Salome's name?
I believe Salome Viljoen, but I think
Okay.
that was close. And Salome, I hope I got that right.
The piece is titled, "Everyone Should Decide How Their Digital Data Are Used, Not Just Tech Companies." So what problem were you and your co-authors hoping to draw attention to in that piece?
I think there's a nexus of problems, and I know that both Salome and Jason have done a lot of work on the political economy of platforms and data, and looking at the way in which access to a lot of these data resources or simply information about platforms and the incentives and business decisions driving them are shielded from scrutiny in a number of different ways. And I think I was coming to that piece with a kind of fundamental concern around data and our assumptions of how it is able to mean or reflect things in our reality. So backing up from there, my background before I got into the kind of AI criticism game was building and sort of managing large scale infrastructures for network measurement. So like low level kind of TCP info dumps and measuring how long it takes a packet to reach another destination, and through that making decisions about how fast or how neutral or how X the internet might be, which was like a very hot policy topic in the early mid 2000s, right? Like who regulates that, and were platforms, common carriers, et cetera. So in that background, I got really or through that process, I got sort of a face first experience of the like duct tape and twine processes that go into trying to like stabilize and create meaning out of data, and the types of politics that go into determining the measurement methodology by which you produce data. So I was working at deciding how we would do a Linux kernel update across a fleet of servers, because when you update the kernel, you're going to update the way in which the numbers that become data are literally produced. So I'm not going to go into that. And then I was also at the FCC, arguing that certain methodologies, which were of course wink, wink, very convenient to the platform companies, were in fact the correct and scientifically sound methods for, knowing whether the networks were neutral or, how fast they were, or, other questions that might have been answered. So that seems like a really roundabout way to get back to the nature piece. But I think it was sort of what ignited my concern over the guileless use of data to sort of make determinations about our world, and the way in which I think the threshold of our demands as people who want to understand these systems better and the political economy driving them is often, I think that horizon is often a little bit, it's not ambitious enough to actually meet to actually answer our questions. By which I mean asking Facebook for more data is still asking Facebook to sort of give us data that is answering their questions, that is reflecting their methodological assumptions, and is basically made up about the world to in ways that fulfill their business interests. It does not necessarily reflect the world around us, nor is it necessarily capable of telling us about that world. It's capable of telling us what platforms want to know about that world.
Right.
So that was my intervention in a piece that was really one of my favorite collaborative projects in the last while, where Salome has done a lot of work on the idea of data cooperatives or cooperative platforms, and Jason has also looked at that. But that was, I guess, really long answer to say that was kind of my animating concern.
Yeah.
How would we create our own data about us and then sort of determine how it's used, instead of begging companies for crumbs and scraps.
Right. I really like how you draw attention in the piece to how the firms are framing up what is interesting and worth looking into. But it's part of the argument also that look, our activities are generating a lot of literally generating this data, right? So is there a kind of rights and access issue there around just kind of consumer rights or citizens' rights to data?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, anything we do that they can instrument to sort of measure and enumerate and sort of, quantify in some database fashion they seem to be willing to, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's sort of interest in our activities as proxies for sort of optimization functions that are sort of
Right.
driving that data. So in one sense, it is ours, right? It's like
Yeah.
tethered to my body in space, in community, in time, in this world. In another sense, it's like made up shit about us that is not,
Yeah.
like I want to be able to contest that. I want to say like that has nothing, I don't fit into that classificatory bucket. That has nothing to do with me. You will never know my inferiority. So I think there is sort of, there's a sort of, I guess, sort of dual right there that I would love to see flexed a little more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember there was like 10 or more years ago, Google had some page that showed you what it thought you was, and I was like 80-year-old British woman, I think, because I, like watched mysteries and drank tea and stuff. So it had me very wrong at that time. I'm sure it's gotten more accurate over time, but
yeah, well, they probably scraped a bunch of credit card databases and other things to sort of, help shore up that clairvoyant guesstimate.
So what do you think the solution is? I mean, I thought one of the reasons I like this piece is because you guys lay out a pretty clear road forward. So what is that?
I mean, I think one solution, and again, like the problem we're solving is pretty big, right? This,
Yes.
kind of rabid form of racial capitalism is literally threatening the future of organized human life. The IPCC report came out yesterday, and I'm dwelling on it, right? But I think one intervention that has a lot of power to interrupt this, I will say, is kind of the idea of I think the idea of data trust is intriguing. I think there are sort of, there are real questions we need to answer again about what the power dynamics of who constitutes data and who data, it purports to describe or to, mean about.
Yeah.
But I think, beginning to sort of constitute data trust or, quantities of data about things that these companies say they, kind of answer, but like, how do we create data about ourselves, and then how do we just define how it's sort of shared? And there was an example that we added to that piece that got cut because editing is hard. But it was just looking at things like the anti-eviction mapping project and Ida B. Wells' Red Record as these sort of examples of truly collaborative and intentional sort of construction of data about communities' lives and experiences that were actually sort of interventions in a much broader discourse. So, how do we begin to think about data in those terms, and then begin to think about, what data do we want? How are we careful about, methodological concerns around how we construct data or how we, know ourselves and each other? And then how do we share those and sort of, access those in ways that help us, live, wonderful, dignified lives.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that does mean sort of excising data or sort of, taking data from some of these platforms. I think knowing what they think they know about us is powerful. And, some of this data may be useful, but I think it is not simply a call to like give it to us and we'll use it, because I think that, there's some tricky power dynamics still in some of the ways that's constructed, as I said.
Yeah. I was thinking about earlier moments. So, back some years ago, I wrote this book about the history of automobile regulation in the United States. And the insurance industry had just loads of data in the mid-20th century that would have been extremely helpful for dealing with all kinds of public problems around accidents and technological change and regulation and such. And yet, the insurance industry is very protective of its data and will argue, of course, just like these, tech firms would, that, it's how they compete in the world. So we'd be undermining their competitiveness. So, like what is your response to that kind of corporate critique of what you're proposing?
I mean, I think we will hear that answer, right? And we've heard that, like they're still flexing arcane laws like Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, right, to stop people from, some of the most minimal forms of inquiry, that are possible from outside of these environments, right? So there is, it is clear that there is a resistance to providing any more information than they would like sort of contained in a marketing pamphlet, right?
Yep.
And that, the sort of, that they claim the right to dictate the stories we tell about these technologies and to sort of own that, that discursive space. I think, I think there are, I don't know. I guess my answer to that is like, yeah, they're going to say that and we need to, work around it, right? There are privacy concerns, right? You can't just like dump this stuff out onto the street and let everyone, kind of rummage through it. But I think, some combination of like auditing what data these firms have and again, what do they call data and how is that structured is a question. And then determining like of what, if any, utility is this data, is kind of a first step that would, again, require kind of just a significant structural overhaul to how we think about these corporations and how we regulate them and, of course, how we like finance campaigns and enable lobbying and all of the rest of the apparatus that comes with it.
Mm-hmm. The other kind of, I could see, I'm just imagining like libertarians, like I'm very far from libertarians, but there's like some version of their in my head I have debates with. And I was thinking about like the public infrastructure side, like the data trust side of it. And I was thinking about like, in a world of kind of constraints around, public money, and we have all these like big public infrastructure maintenance problems already. Like we're just terrible with like the systems we build. Like why do you think building kind of data trust or public digital infrastructure of this sort is kind of like worth it for the public?
Well, I think it's, I think ways of knowing ourselves and our communities and our infrastructures are worthwhile, right?
Yeah.
And if we're going to take the frame that right now tech companies have both the, have claimed the right to both sort of make meaning about us, incorrect or not, and claim the right to sort of hide that and use it, only to answer their own questions, right? Only in relation to those, then I think there is just a clear argument to be made that like, no, you should, why on earth would you have the, have the right to do that when we don't, right? There's just a kind of civic-minded argument. I think there is a much bigger question in this like moment of kind of climate collapse inflection. And in this moment where like literally nothing else works, it's just everything is janky and crumbling and there's like a compounded janky system crumbling. Like, is it possible that this could be sort of somehow stood up as an exception to that rule? And no, I don't think so. Like, again, we're looking at a halcyon future in which a lot of different things are very, very different, including like our, willingness to truly invest in, in like actual social good and not some, glossy tech marketing that claims the term.
Yeah. I saw there was some interaction on Twitter where I saw you kind of talking about this issue. I mean, with climate change, a lot of the way we do computing right now is just premised on these totally unrealistic energy futures that we can't sustain, right? So you can easily imagine futures where computing is at a different place than it is today, and it kind of drawn back, like smaller scale stuff, right? Not going forward these enormous cloud-based server farms and stuff like that. Yeah,
I think I was being a bit flip probably because it's Twitter, but I don't see how these sort of data intensive processes that require, massive cooling rigs and, just these really fragile sort of supply chain infrastructures are going to survive like, a couple more hits of like massive flooding in a place that data centers are, exist, or, Amazon infrastructure going out just like one too many times for us to be able to ignore that they control most of the web. I think these things are coming. And then the question of like, how do we all carry, a tracking device, or how do we, how do they continue to computationally instrument us to sort of keep that cycle going is germane.
Totally. And the maintenance issues are huge. I won't go there right now, but
it's huge. So that's like where the money is, right? This is this thing like, the group at Google that I was in was a technical infrastructure group. And that was, you could tell that was where the power was because they didn't have to do, they didn't have any marketing. Right? They didn't have to do anything. Yeah. They didn't have to do talks. Yeah. No one had to know about them, right? But their budgets were by far the most zeros, and the amount of human labor, the amount of people carrying a pager for every small instance of this, just times 11 billion. And I think one of my frustrations with this is that has been so well hidden in the narrative about tech that it's has to be revived in every single conversation about these futures.
Yeah. I totally agree with you. So my teachers taught me never to assume because it makes an ass out of you and me. But just kind of doing the work you've done, I assumed that you had some kind of degree in computing falsely. So how did you, how did you come to work at Google, starting with a degree in rhetoric from Berkeley?
Rhetoric and English. So really
all right.
doubled down on that career choice. I graduated Berkeley in 2006, and Google was small, and I put my resume on Monster and I just was very broke, and so I was looking for work, and I'd thought about grad school, but at that time and coming from what I came from, I didn't have the sort of examples of successful people who'd gone to grad school. It just seemed like what rich kids could do, and I was very worried about rent. And Google was the one that hired me. And so I had no interest in tech. I didn't know what a server was. I remember a man explaining that a server was a computer, and I was like, huh. It was always a man explaining something. Yeah. But I got into it at that time, and I was just really curious about what, why these people were so smug. Why, where does this the competence they all floated on, right? They had just refrigerators, back when kombucha was $7 a bottle and alcoholic, they had just refrigerators full of kombucha. And, I was like, why, where is this richness? Is this just a class is this how all of these folks live? Is this just I haven't been in the right class? Or is this what's going on? And so I think I was just driven by trying to answer these very basic questions, into a rabbit hole of then starting to understand these systems. And I was also there at a very early time. So I think there were somewhere 2,500 people total working for the company, and it's over 200,000 now if you count contractors, which you absolutely must. And so I was there, I was there at a time where I don't know, I've described it in the past as I didn't realize the check wasn't made out to me. So I kept trying to cash it by being I want 20% projects, and then I just kind of got away with it. And then I started working in standards, and then I started working in measurement, which is of course a form of standardization. And then I got real deep into just how do you think about the kind of politics and practicalities of data construction and running, this effort. And then I built that out into a research group that was kind of tackling the fun things that I thought were most interesting, which were generally more, kind of socially minded issues privacy and then everyone started talking about machine learning and AI, and it seemed really suspect to me because it was this sort of data dependency that we'd just sort of forgotten all of these lessons, or at least I was being asked to forget all of the lessons that I'd learned, pulling teeth to make a measurement system that I could claim was capable of reflecting the world it said it reflected.
So I hang out in the small world of historians of standardization. So that's, I know. How did you get into standards? How'd you start doing that work?
So I also, I mentioned, I started at Google. They didn't hire me because they're oh, brilliant, come on to an elite role. I did customer support. So I was writing documentation for Writely, which was an acquisition they just had, which became Google Docs, but that was it was just sort of, at that point it was a janky app they acquired, and I was writing documentation and doing help center stuff for Writely. And there was this standards battle that was fomenting at the time around Microsoft trying to release this standard called OOXML. So it was the open office format or something. Yep. And it was one of the problems with standardization is it relies on these kind of like outdated ceremonies in which, you assume a community of practice that is on relatively equal footing. You assume good faith, and it's primarily volunteer work that then, of course, is like underwritten by whoever is willing to pay you to volunteer to go to these standards committees, right? So it's like fairly easy to infiltrate, and now we're having all of these conversations of like, shit, China figured it out, right? But like this has been going on forever. And Microsoft was trying to sort of pass this standard off as open by, kind of some combination of just like being very present in a number of standard bodies and kind of like, rigging the vote in some way. And I don't remember all the details at all, but the standard was not truly open. And so the contest there was like Google Docs, which was like, nay rightly, was wanting to interoperate with Word via this standard, right? And so I figured out a way to get myself on the team that was like pushing back against that. And then I got kind of involved in the standard communities, and then I started working with like Vint Cerf, and there's this little group that did standard stuff. And like, I basically did like the networking world for a very long time. So I would go to all the like network standards meetings and just knew that community really well. But that was my entree. And that was also like it was also like how it was a good lesson in the way that like the commodification of like network technologies and the way that it was sort of transformed from a kind of military funded academic discipline with industries sort of built around it to kind of a primarily commercial endeavor, like meant that there were like a lot of like vestigial organizations and like again, like rituals around standardization or what have you that were like very easy to instrument by these companies.
This is like probably skipping forward a couple years, but I think one of the earliest ways some people came to hear about you is that you were one of the core organizers of the Google Walkouts, which took place in 2018. So in case listeners don't know about the Walkouts or have forgotten about them, can you explain what they were and why they were important? Yeah,
well, so I was one of the core organizers, but it was really like there was like thousands of people who organized. So it was I think the biggest manifestation of labor organizing that had been sort of fomenting at Google and other tech companies for a moment. And it was a global walkout across, I forget how many, but most of Google's campuses globally, including like a data center in Oklahoma and a number of other places. Anyway, it was a kind of mini strike. And it was protesting kind of a nexus of issues that had to do with this sort of persistent culture of sexual harassment and discrimination, the persistent culture of racism and discrimination. And, we were working to interweave those with some of the structural discrimination, like the way sort of, the racial discrimination exists on a kind of at the border of like full-time and contract workers, right? And sort of, you have the bulk of contract workers are made up of racialized people, generally Black or brown people, whereas full-time workers are generally white, and those, like the affordances that gives them. And then, looking also at the way in which some of the business decisions, like the, decision to build artificial intelligence for the U.S. drone program are also sort of, decisions that reflect that ethos, right? The people who are going to be harmed are generally racialized minorities, and the people who are, benefiting and going to Davos and, profiting off of these decisions are generally white. So it was about 20,000 people walked out, and I think it was a very visible spectacle that helped publicize a lot of the work, the labor organizing work that had been going on in sort of quieter form.
Right. Like the Tech Workers Coalition, for instance, started a bit earlier. It's like 2014 or 2015, but it felt like one of these moments where there were a bunch of things coming together and maybe something of a turning point.
I hope so. I mean, I think my turning point there was like around Maven, and that's when I sort of, I'd been supportive of Tech Workers Coalition, and I've been supportive of like, the idea of organizing unions or organizing labor in tech, which seems, both obvious and remote for a long time for me. But it was around Maven when I was, I just felt like it was such a clear contest of power. Like that, they're going to sign these contracts because that's how you meet the revenue goals for cloud, right? Like there is no question about that. And so we're going to
So
have some teeth.
explain what Maven was and what the significance of it was.
Maven was a contract that Google signed with the U.S. Department of Defense to build machine vision recognition systems that would be employed in the U.S. drone war. And it was, but Maven itself was important as this kind of catalyst project that was trying to realize this vision of further entangling U.S. big tech with the U.S. military, which has a number of strategic advantages. But this is a project that like Ash Carter and Eric Schmidt and a number of folks, sort of like Obama era military folks and tech executives, had been kind of fomenting for a minute. And I don't actually know all the details. I sort of saw it like, through the tea leaves for a while, but there was, Maven sort of kicked that off, and it's becoming, the fact that it became a flashpoint at Google and catalyzed labor organizing was something that, I at least sort of, I think helped the DoD walk back some of the claims. But as I say that, I'm like, no, they just stood up an ethics council and said it was ethical. But
you brought up a bunch of stuff I want to return to a little bit later. But first, I mean, at about the same time that the walkout's happening and eventually you leave Google, you're also were co-founding the AI Now Institute, right? Was that happening pretty close to like the same time? Yeah,
AI Now was officially founded at NYU like November 2017.
Okay.
And then so I'm like putting like a calendar image in my brain right now to like map this linearly. And then it was like early 2018. So I think it was about February 2018 when the Maven stuff kicked off. And that had been like, it was actually like, I began a lot of that around the time AI Now became official at NYU. And then I was just like doing both for a while.
Yeah. And so tell me a bit about why you co-founded, AI Now and what you originally hoped to do with it.
I think, well, I mean, there's a number of ways to answer this. I think originally I was on the inside of Google and I've been sort of steeping in that. And I was getting increasingly worried about, AI and just like how like catnip the hype was. Just everyone was suddenly a machine learning engineer. I had, like none of these words meant anything anymore. And there was sort of like a way in which that sort of erased these concerns about like, data and meaning and all of this stuff that had seemed to at least have some purchase on reasonable people in the past that, I'd flatter myself to think at least. And there was a moment when like some dude from Harvard pitched me on funding a genocide detection machine learning system. And I was like, okay, fuck this. Pardon me, audience. I just didn't understand what was going on. And that like is usually where everything starts for me, where I'm like, well, I'll try to answer the question. And then 40 years later, I'm like, not even close. But I think, and so I was like concerned about this. And I was also seeing the sort of hype on the outside, like the Wired articles and the way in which like the tech industry like carefully instrumented transhumanism to give the veneer of intelligence to this sort of like marketing push around machine learning and AI. Like all of this was like the, this sort of nexus of issues. And it seemed like there needed to be a counterbalance that was asking different questions and sort of creating at least like a public reference point for some of these issues. And it seems fun to do that at a university. I liked collaborating with people outside of Google because I didn't always get along with the culture, and oftentimes I'd find more sort of sympathetic folks in different spaces. And let's be clear, this is at a time when like anything connected to the tech industry and anything connected to like AI in particular was so attractive to universities who are looking for tech funding, who are looking for, some way to like polish their image with this sort of new shibboleth of AI. So I would say I took advantage of that in a lot of senses because I was able to bring my own budget. I had a lot of money at Google and I was sort of directing it. So I was able to bring my own budget. I was like, okay, we're gonna put this into funding AI Now. And like I was able to get dual affiliation at NYU, which is a practice we could talk about, but it's like pretty common in the AI field. And it just means that a tech company pays you, but you have a university affiliation. And no one bats an eye. So
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty amazing. Wow. Again, you bring up so much I want to ask you about. Well, I mean, I think, like when you first thought about, you start up AI now and you first start doing this work. I mean, what did you initially want to do? I mean, I think part of the story you're telling is that as you've kind of had experience inside of this certain kind of institution, like things have changed for all of us, right? Our visions of AI have changed and this. But wait, what do you remember what you initially wanted to kind of set out to do?
So, like, this is not claiming that I did it. I think I learned a lot about the academia industry and about the sort of limitations of some of these forms in the process.
Yeah.
But, I think initially it seemed like a really, like a cool, clever plan, right? Like, how do we get the resources and attention onto a more radical project that all of these sort of like weak sauce, like, I'm not going to name names because I'm diplomatic, but like there were a number of like centers and endowed institutes and what have you that were sort of dedicated to like, researching the super intelligence 100 years off, right?
Yeah.
So it's, it's not hard to justify that like we need to look at the practical problems now. And for me at the time, because of, all types of converged privilege, I was able to bring a bunch of money and I was able to like bring, the Google imprimatur, right? And I was like, okay, can we use this to basically get the types of resources these centers have for something that's going to be doing something very different. And, the hope then was to be able to, make discursive change that would at least undermine the surety of some of the marketing. And I think we were successful on that, but then I think like discursive change is not necessarily always like good, right? Like there's a number of like techniques that have just cabined off these questions again. So like, we're now looking at bias bounties, right? Which is reframed bias to be kind of a technical flaw found in the depths of code and fixed, right? Like we're, like the struggle's not over. And I think it was, again, I think there are limitations of working within sort of the academic frame. But yeah, that's basically the story.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I just want to say that like I'm just always impressed by the folks around AI now. I mean, two people that come to mind quickly are Joy Rankin and Theo Dreyer. But there's just so many smart people there. So I mean, I think it's a great group of folks.
It is. Yeah.
And when it comes to weak sauce, I was lucky in quotation marks to go at an event at IBM Watson's office in Manhattan. It was the lamest thing I ever went. It was like the floor I was brought in on was just a showpiece to try to loop in to seduce executives from other firms to buy Watson talent, basically, is like the floor I was brought in on with other folks. And then, after we met Watson, again in quotation marks, that was lame too, we went to this like event where we sat on a stage, and who did they bring in to talk about these things but transhumanists? It was all about like how, AI was going to, break down the boundary between machines and people. And so like that's the level of the discourse at about the same time that you were setting up AI Now. And I think it's really important to remember that was kind of what corporations were up to with academics and others, is that kind of crap.
Yeah, it was bleak. And it was, it was at a time you could say like data has bias, and like 8 men would say no, data is math, right? It was a very like it was, we were struggling for very rudimentary gains at that point. And and I think we've moved somewhat, right? There is now like real contestation that is like not as interested in the technical mechanism as it is in the business model or in the power relationships that are sort of implied in that model. And I like that's where I think we can focus attention and hopefully, actually perturb these companies.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you kind of about two sides of, where AI has been in the last 4 or 5 years. So on the one side, I want to talk about like what to do about hype. So some of the more dramatic predictions about the potentials of AI, like Brynjolfsson and McAfee's second machine age, right? Like this kind of fantasies that AI was going to take away all our jobs and stuff like that. I mean, that just hasn't panned out yet. We can say yet if we want to. And like technology scholars like Jeff Funk have looked at like, top 40 funded AI firms and say they're unlikely to create big changes soon. It's going to be long and slow and iterative. So, how do you think about the kind of mismatch between the claims that have been made about AI versus what we're actually seeing on the ground, and knowing that, it's not like the claims are doing nothing. People are spending billions upon billions of dollars and restructuring all kinds of things in the name of this technology. So how do you think about that mix?
The claims are certainly like moving capital and focus,
Yep.
right? Like they have some, a lot of power. And the kind of AI is taking all our jobs, right? Like that was really, it's a really popular claim, like among the Davos set, because it quietly like reifies the claims made about AI, which are closer to the transhumanist side than it is to like, this is sort of patchwork technology that's never going to quite work. Right. And so if AI is capable of taking all our jobs, then wow, AI is capable of doing what I do. It is like in some way, like we've already made an analogy there that is pretty powerful and very, very convenient. Right.
Yep.
And then it like allows them to be the architects of a solution where they're like, well, we can't call it welfare, but we can call it universal basic employment. Right. And so there's sort of an industry around like taking the staging of the problem as a given and then like spinning up all sorts of solutions that are never like rarely historically informed, rarely like, the experimental design, if they even test them, is just like atrocious. Like it's like kind of play acting. Right.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, you have companies like Uber where like the regulatory arbitrage that is masked in a lot of that hype is sort of moving along to like deeply degrade our jobs and our labor rights, et cetera. So I don't know that it's like a buying time tactic, but I know there is certainly like an industry around like elevating your weakest critics and sort of taking them seriously enough that it like backs you, like it backs everyone into a corner, which you suddenly, again, are the arbiter of, what is the solution and what is the problem.
So elevating your weakest critics plays exactly into the other question I wanted to ask, because I feel like criticism of AI became very popular since, 2017 or 2018. And you could even say it kind of became an industry in itself. I mean, people were getting not insignificant book deals and fetching several $1,000s per speech to talk about bias and algorithms. And at the same time, I'm also not going to name names here because I'll try to be diplomatic, but, have these kind of centers opening up around ethics and humane this or that around technology, right? And I think, they were kind of people would argue they're watering it down because it was all about ethics, but probably not regulation. They're not going into. So, how does a kind of casual observer of this scene, or say a newspaper reader, supposed to sort out the kind of wheat from the chaff when it comes to, this AI criticism space? It gets very confusing.
I don't know what I would observe or what I would advise folks to do there. Like I still get, my dad writes me, it's like, have you seen The Social Dilemma? And I'm like, and he's, I'm like, yeah, I had to.
Right. For work. I remember the day I had to watch The Social Dilemma for work. It was a really, really painful day.
The profession is processing painful knowledge. But there's certainly an industry, right? Yeah. And there's certainly I think what is interesting about it is like, it's a lot of times those critics seem really compelling, right? Because you're like, holy shit, the specter of this badness is so, it's like libidinal. You're like, oh my God, there's a system controlling my mind. And, it's superhuman. And so the way in which the problem is set out is really, it's alarming, and it feels like this must be a very serious person who's like taken risks or who has sort of like done their work to present this problem to us. And then the remediation is like, and if we're talking about like, humane centers or what have you, the remediation is like turn off notifications in the evening or something. You're like, what? I thought it was going to be like a gun with fire or something. Yeah. I think it's, there's a clever bait and switch that happens there where like the problem is so extreme and like, that again, it does this thing of like reifying the tech company's definition of AI, right? So it's like, like it is controlling our minds and like, implied there is it has the potential to control our minds, right? Or it has the ability to control our minds, which is exactly the kind of marketing that they want, right? And then the remediation is fairly weak. And I think, you also have this in like the kind of slightly more critical, like maybe like less kind of comically, soft on criticism, but like, like there is sort of criticism that will mention power, right? But then like, I'm like, name names, right? Like who, which firm, right? Like how do you map that? How does that actually like construct a blueprint by which we can better understand how power flows and like better take it back, right? And I think there's, you can say like it's power, we need regulation, right? Well, like Microsoft has been lobbying for regulation for a long time. And that regulation looks like, notice without consent on facial recognition, right? So like, I think it's, there's also just a kind of laziness to a lot of it that is, either intentional or not. But I guess I have one more thing to say about this too. A lot of it gets bolted onto the side of technical conferences or sort of technical fields. And this is by design because you always, these companies and this industry wants to maintain the primacy of kind of computer science as the sort of expertise that can ultimately speak to these issues. So you have things like to apply for an NSF grant on some of these issues, you have to have at least one person with a computer science degree applying, right? Which is not the type of skills you would actually need to really address these issues. And at the same time, then you have like, ethics and bias and even sort of anti-racism being bolted onto the side of conferences like NeurIPS or, other machine learning conferences where you don't have people at those conferences who are actually sort of like from the disciplines that would be needed to like peer review this stuff, right? So there's sort of a, like I really do think we need to take the task of expertise more seriously and the task of like interdisciplinarity more seriously, even though that word has become kind of a buzzword for just like get everyone in a room. But like I think, like how do you actually like co-construct knowledge when it requires this sort of like vast set of vantages?
I really enjoyed reading your forthcoming piece, The Steep Cost of Capture. And now, when I read it, I can see it kind of as a reflection of your experiences over the last 4 or 5 years. And, it looks at how heavily AI research is currently captured by large digital technology companies. And I mean, it's just so true when you think about it. I mean, their money is just like running the show, including on lots of these social, ethical, things we were just talking about. So, what do you think the risk is? I think it's obvious, but I think it's also good to say. And then, what alternative do you think we should hope for?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the risk is like the risk of kind of captured knowledge production, right? And so it does, like, I think I still need to do like another edit pass on that piece, but I was trying to get it, there's sort of like a double-edged thing that is happening, wherein the fact that these companies control the research, the infrastructure needed to sort of make data and compute intensive machine learning means that they were sort of initially able to kind of redirect the field toward that framing, right? So it became AI, like this sort of, so-called deep learning became kind of, swelled to like expand to become AI and the AI field, even though there are sort of other techniques and it's just like a hodgepodge of, stuff they threw against the wall over 70 years. But like that became the focus and it became sort of synonymous with AI. And then they sort of richly funded that through all of the familiar mechanisms. There's grants, there's scholarship programs, there's sort of like, we're going to take over your conference and we're going to fund it, all of it. And sort of the, kind of pumped up the field. And, drew a lot of attention, a lot of money, and a lot of, it became much more strategically important for universities. And then that, because there's so much money in it and because you can't really do the research without, you can't do most of this sort of you can't answer the questions that are animating the field, let's say, without access to massive compute infrastructure and data, which is, owned by these, like, we're not even talking about like company environments. We're talking about like 5 different companies, right? The people who have platforms, right? Like the Amazon, in order, I think it's Amazon, Microsoft and Google are the biggest cloud providers, but then like, of course, Facebook has its own. And if you're sort of, somehow linked up with Facebook, you're going to get access to those. And IBM is sort of like a kind of small concern, right? But you still need, like, again, let's get back to maintenance. Let's get back to the cost of running these things. You're not going to stand up your own on-premises sort of compute, not to do this like, GPU or TPU intensive sort of training, right? So you need access to that somehow. And either you pay for that in a grant and maybe you half train a model and then your AWS credits like expire. And then what are you going to do? You're not going to write the paper. You're not going to get it in NeurIPS. Or you become a Google Scholar or a Facebook PhD or whatever, and you get access to these infrastructures. So it's, it's captured on the kind of like, we can't materially do the research without getting access to these, infrastructures. And so we know, like, we're making a choice between maybe not answering questions, like, we're not going to ask questions that would like piss off Facebook and, kind of have them drop us from this infrastructure, because then our scholarly careers will be compromised. And I think there are parallels here in like network engineering as well, when like the NSF net was privatized and when sort of the companies began to run all the networks that then had all the data that used to be the provenance of a field that then sort of had to suddenly like beg Comcast or AT&T or whatever for data. But I think it's much more extreme because it's much more extreme because of the sort of like global scope and the claims that are being made about what AI can do, and then what that does to pressure folks who might want to sort of create counter narratives or to sort of ask those questions that would piss the companies off.
Yeah, and another thing I think you do a really good job of in the current version of the piece is point out that these companies, they silence and punish critics from within. So it's not like you can just do this work and then if something comes up, become a whistleblower without like serious consequences for your career, right? And there are real examples of this.
Yeah. I mean, I'm one of them.
Yeah.
Although, like, I would say serious consequences, I have a lot of privilege. So I just, I was able to sort of move into NYU permanently. But I think, the example of what happened to Sunit Gebru and Margaret Mitchell is kind of, makes it really clear that if you begin to pursue research questions and answer them honestly, and those answers perturb the company's bottom line, they will figure out how to punish you and how to discredit you so that your answers will have less weight within that discourse. So it's pretty classic. And to do this, I went back to some of the histories of kind of the military silencing of whistleblowers around the Star Wars program and around some of the military funded like tech to be like, okay, where do we see a record of like institutions with a similarly situated power over knowledge production, sort of exercising their power to, shut people up when it might, go against their agenda.
Mm-hmm. As we were saying earlier, there's been a lot of kind of criticisms of the tech industry. Many issues have been raised. And some of it's fluff, like my favorite example is some article I saw, like, in the future, your sex robot may kill you or something like that. It was like, this is what we need to worry about when it comes to digital technology or something. But this is something you focus on a lot. So like, if you had to create a short list of topics that you think like are things that we should really be paying attention to right now and really are concerning, what are you most focused on?
Like in tech or just overall? Because
yeah, why don't we say like in the digital technology industry? Because otherwise you and I are probably going to talk about like, racist infrastructures and climate change and like really pressing issues that are all around us, right? So why don't we just focus on digital technology?
Yeah, that sounds like a good plan. I mean, I think. I'm trying to figure out where to like get into this answer. One of the things that has disturbed me most over the last handful of years, but has sort of escalated in I would say last year and a half, is the domination of the policy debate in DC by folks like Eric Schmidt, and that concerns me. Just from a real pragmatic angle, because that's not being picked up on by a lot of the critics or the people who purport to like write model legislation, right? Like there's actually there's a battle happening right now, and the discourse is now kind of being run by folks like Schmidt who, are on the National Security Commission of AI, which is another worrying development. And that, the kind of the way I'm seeing those concerns, and this is part of a research initiative that I'm doing with Amba Kak and Shazida Ahmed and Nandina Beganzos at AI Now, who are all really wonderful scholars, and I would suggest checking them out, dear reader. But looking at the way in which a narrative that sort of stages a great powers conflict between the US and China, in which one will come out as the sort of AI winner and the other will be the AI loser, and sort of narrates this as a battle between democratic values, which are sort of, kind of at like blood level American, and authoritarian values, which are seen as sort of like what Chinese tech embodies, it's now sort of taken for granted as common sense among a lot of the people who are going to be making decisions around like, how do you deal with the concentrated powers of this company? And it's being used by folks like Schmidt and by the narratives that, the kind of tech infiltrated National Security Council on AI and the sort of lobbyists that are kind of swarming that process right now are creating, that this is, this is a reason that we need to not only not perturb these companies and their, AI by creating, accountability regulation or, banning facial recognition or what have you, but that it is actually like a reason we need to invest more in these companies. And one of the ways this is being accomplished is like the term AI is it is used in a way that like communicates like AI as a scientific innovation, right? And we need more AI. And this is just we're come to the stage in human life where AI is now possible and we need it, right? That, of course, elides the fact that only a handful of companies have all of the resources needed to construct AI. So if you wrote a little Chrome script that would change AI to like Google, Amazon, Microsoft, you would get a better picture of what's being called for in these bills. But there isn't, there's no like agonism around that at all. And so you have things like a proposal to democratize AI with access to, kind of a federal AI research platform that would give people access to compute and give people access to data, and then more AI, and we're like beating China. And of course, the like fine print is that, like, as you, Lee, know, like working on sort of maintenance issues and like how expensive and entrenched these things are, like you're never gonna like roll your own platform, right? That's going to be licensed from these companies. It's going to sort of, compound their power. And again, it's sort of erasing the fact that these are technologies that are, only possible right now, within these handful of like very powerful corporate environments. So that's like, I have a lot of worries that stem from that. I have a lot of worries around like bordering and the way AI is going to be used for, bordering around climate. I have a lot of worries about like, we're not actually pushing back on this narrative clearly enough. We're sort of, anyway, but let's start with that one.
That's really interesting. I mean, it's like, and it also, I think, touches on how, so much of the kind of anti-monopoly and antitrust rhetoric that we saw there before the election with Biden has kind of died away. And now, I think we see a lot of kind of neo-Cold War stuff around China is pretty common. So, I think you're raising like a huge set of issues there for sure.
Yeah. I mean, and hopefully Lena Khan and others can sort of, I think there are people who are willing to fight for it, but I think it's not going to be just like a one weird trick, right? It's an actual fight.
So there you go. I mean, that brings up the next thing I wanted to ask you about, actually. So, I mean, I just know from Twitter interactions and seeing you talk about things that you're really a believer in kind of social movement politics and activism and the need for, when I asked you about the Google walkouts, you said it's, like there were core organizers, but it was thousands of people. And I think that's the key thing in your eyes. So, and when I think about kind of the broad field of science and technology studies and kind of people who draw attention to social movements, I think about you, and I think about Lily Irani has been talking a lot about this issue. I think about Jathan also. So, I mean, have you always thought, social movements were really important, or is this something that you came to kind of later?
I don't know if I formulated it that way. Like I was sort of, I don't know, like an art school radical, right? Like I did Food Not Bombs, but I don't know that I had like I didn't have like a theory to back up a lot of that when I was younger. But it seemed, like it was more just looking at like, okay, how do you, let's try to have an outcome in which we're able to like push back on these companies or on this, right? Like, okay, we have, let's look at how much power they have over our lawmaking and policymaking processes. Like huge amount of power, right? Like the policy team is like writing, marking up legislation, right? Like it's, like they're spending more, tech is spending more on lobbying than big tobacco and big oil right now. Like I don't think we can like have a theory of change again where it's like we'll finally find like the one regulation and they will sort of obey it, right? Like let's look at who has power right now. And clearly like these companies do, and clearly we have a deeply compromised, government. And I won't go into that more, but like it's, then I began sort of reading, I was like, okay, so where else does power come from, right? Like, well, labor organizing, like maybe a union. And I didn't, that's not my tradition. I didn't come out of that. So I just started reading and I was like, oh shit, there's like a hidden history where like this shit really works. Right.
Yeah.
And I think it's like, it's a tool we have in the absence of many other tools. Right. And it's a tool that like, if you get into like like the primary sources before they've sort of re-narrated it, right? Like it's a tool that works and it scares people. And I don't believe, I believe in it as like we definitely need like much more democratic, much more sort of socially minded means of deciding our shared future. Like that is clear. And social movements can like help us get there. And learning how to organize together so like we don't each have to be some like libertarian multi-tool of everything, but we actually like learn how to live in community with each other and do things together. Like those also seem just like basic survival techniques that we're certainly going to need. So I don't, I believe in social movements. I believe in sociality, right? Like I believe that there's something like profound, particularly in a workplace environment, to like realigning your relationships with your colleagues as ones of like love and conviviality, and being like, we're no longer competing to like get to this, top of this hierarchy in a structure that was designed to sort of atomize us. We're beginning to rep each other and we're beginning to sort of replace the identity that was, constructed around like we're, like individual shining stars able to pass a Google interview process to one that is like much more solidaristic. And I think there's also like a power that can actually, have a prefigurative transformative effect on people and on the environments in which they work on and they live in. And it's, I would love to see something like that in academia as well, because I think the same sort of individualistic pathologies attend both industries.
Oh my God. Yes. Meredith, I want to let listeners know that you did not see my script beforehand, but it's funny because you keep setting up my my next question. So, and it has to do with this point about sociality and being together on a kind of non-atomistic way in our workplaces. Because I think a confusion many people have when they hear about like labor movements and tech or the Tech Workers Coalition is they just think about workers' issues as a very constrained set of things, like it's about wages, or maybe it also tackles racism and sexism. You can see that in a kind of classical narrow sense, but it's about more than that, right? I mean, it also is about Google workers and others raising questions about whether the firm should be working with ICE, the immigration and customs enforcement, or you brought up Maven earlier, or what the firm's relationship should be to the Chinese state and censorship and these kinds of issues. So, I mean, what is that more encompassing image of labor and labor movements at play, which might be broader than the narrow one many people think of?
Yeah. Well, in laying out this capacious vision of labor, I will be, it's referencing a tradition that is sort of pre-World War II, a kind of, a much more sort of social justice minded, like a political unionism, right? That recognized workers as having a very particular place and a very particular set of levers under capitalism vis-a-vis the ability to withdraw their labor and then to demand things in as a condition of laboring once more, or perhaps to demand ownership over the means of production totally. And then that is, that was the goal of a lot of unionism, before kind of a number of post World War II compromises, right? So this is not like blue sky thinking, right? This is looking at, how do we realign how we think about labor and worker power in particular as a lever in the face of the threats we are currently facing, which are, massive multinational corporations that don't, they don't fit in the boundaries of one firm. They certainly don't, there's no such thing as a shop and there's no such thing as a floor in a lot of these contexts, right? We're thinking about like, what would power over Amazon look like? And that would necessarily need to, include warehouse workers. It would necessarily need to include, supply chains. It would necessarily be like a much broader vision than, like I am in solidarity with people whose contract relationship with the same firm looks like mine. Yeah. And it, it recognizes that those boundaries of sort of who is a worker and who has a stake in this fight extend beyond sort of the employment contract. And this is, there's folks who've looked at sort of the unemployed as a, the revolutionary core, like James Boggs writes about this and others. But, looking at, okay, we are Google workers against sort of ICE, right? Like who is being harmed by ICE and what are the, alliances with, say, folks on the U.S. southern border who are kind of fighting back against the conditions of kind of a surveillance and tracking equipped ICE that, is being enabled by Google workers in Mountain View. So I think this is, we need these levers if we're going to fight these issues, is my contention. Yeah. And we need to think about, a revived labor movement that takes on these much bigger political demands, for all of the reasons. And because I think that's like what's actually animating a lot of people right now, right? Like there's, we talk about Google, but we can talk about Amazon and the Climate Workers Alliance, right? And where, they were fighting Amazon's contracts with fossil fuel companies. They were fighting Amazon's sort of carbon emissions through their logistics platform. They were fighting the way in which Amazon's climate impacts was sort of harming low-income communities where the warehouses and sort of the trucking depots and all of that were placed. And so they, they were linking all of these issues and recognizing that like Amazon as a sort of parastate power at this point had a hand in all of them and that those needed, and that they had some leverage that they could use there. And excitingly, there's 2 cases now coming before the NLRB that are arguing that, fighting for these bigger political concerns is kind of covered within the concerted protected activity, which is going to be a big, it's going to be a big deal if they start enforcing that.
Yeah. So what's next for you? What's next for AI now? I mean, what are your plans?
I mean, I think I could talk about some of the research that's coming up, but like I'm really happy to be working with the folks that I'm working with, and I think one of the things I'm thinking through right now, very honestly, is like what is the role of the kind of the censor, the academic censor or the institute, like how what can a form like that do to sort of ask the right questions and answer them responsibly. Sort of link up with advocates and movement work, and to be, actually kind of useful in moving some of these causes forward. And I think, I think there certainly is a lot of use, right? And then I've learned over the years that there are also real, there are ways in which I think we could structure a lot of this work better. And I'm, particularly interested in how do we begin to create like networks of folks doing this work across the institutional boundaries in ways that are not just sort of, like, let's have a funder bring us together for dinner every quarter or every 6 months, but are like, where we're actually accountable to each other, we're actually sort of building knowledge together, and we're actually creating kind of the links that we could, hopefully draw on when one or another of us gets sort of pressed by our institution, which is also something that I think is not inevitable, but it's certainly something that's going to happen to some of us given the amount of power opposing this work and the way in which that power is entangled with the university.
Yeah. Well, Meredith, thank you for your time today, and thank you for all the work you're doing. I think it's really important. I think AI now is a great place, and it's full of great people. So thanks for pulling it together.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been such a delight to talk to you, Lee, and I appreciate all of your work as well, and particularly the persistent focus on maintenance, which is how I learned about your work 5 or 6 years ago. So it's been really nice to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast. Peoples and things, like most things in this world, depends on the work of many people. I want to thank my brother Lee Vinsel for writing the music for the show. I want to thank my buddy Juliana Castro for designing the logos for the podcast. You can check out her work at julianacastro.co. Peoples and Things is a production of Virginia Tech Publishing and the University Libraries at Virginia Tech. Production activities are supported by the Athenaeum, a space in the library that acts as a hub for digital humanities teaching, learning, and creation. Joe Fort is the Athenaeum coordinator and digital humanities specialist at VT Libraries, and he serves as producer and sound engineer for the podcast. For information about other podcasts from Virginia Tech Publishing, visit publishing.vt.edu. I also want to thank you for listening. Thanks.